The desert wind carried dust and broken promises through the small town of Copper Ridge, Arizona. 8-year-old Elena Redhawk pressed her face against the cracked window of their modest adobe house, watching her father, Thomas, mend a broken fence post in their front yard. His weathered hands moved with the practiced precision of a man who had learned to make do with little, his Apache heritage evident in the quiet dignity with which he carried himself, despite the town's often cold shoulder. "Papa, why don't the other kids at school want to play with me?" Elena had asked him just that morning, her dark eyes reflecting a hurt too deep for her young age. Thomas had knelt down, placing his calloused hands on her small shoulders. "Mija, some people fear what they don't understand. But remember this," he had pointed to his chest, then to hers. "We carry the strength of our ancestors here. That makes us different, but it also makes us strong." The approaching sound of heavy boots on gravel interrupted Elena's memory. Through the dusty glass, she watched as Sheriff Marcus Wade emerged from his patrol car, his imposing figure casting a long shadow across their yard. Behind him walked Deputy Collins, a nervous-looking man who always seemed to shrink in Wade's presence. Elena had seen Sheriff Wade around town many times. He was a man who commanded attention wherever he went, tall, broad-shouldered, with steel-gray hair and eyes that seemed to assess everyone as either useful or disposable. The silver star on his chest caught the afternoon sunlight as he strode toward their home with the confidence of a man who had never been questioned. "Thomas Redhawk!" Wade's voice boomed across the yard, causing her father to straighten and turn. "I need to have a word with you." Elena watched her father's posture change. The easy confidence he showed at home shifted into something more guarded, more careful. It was a change she had seen before when dealing with certain people in town, a survival instinct passed down through generations. "Sheriff Wade," Thomas replied, setting down his tools and walking toward the two lawmen. "What can I do for you?" Wade's hand rested casually on his belt near his weapon. "We've had reports of stolen cattle from the Morrison Ranch. Witnesses saw someone matching your description in the area." Elena's young mind struggled to process what she was hearing. Her father, who taught her about honesty and integrity, being accused of theft. She pressed closer to the window, her heart beginning to race. "Sheriff, I was here yesterday working on my fence. My neighbor, Mrs. Garcia, can vouch for that." Thomas's voice remained steady, but Elena could detect the underlying tension. "Mrs. Garcia?" Wade scoffed. "Another one of your kind. Her word doesn't carry much weight around here." The casual racism in Wade's tone made Elena's stomach twist. She had heard similar comments at school, but hearing it directed at her father felt like a physical blow. "Sheriff, I understand you have a job to do, but I'm telling you the truth. I had nothing to do with any stolen cattle." Wade stepped closer to Thomas, using his height to intimidate. "See, that's the problem with your people, Redhawk. You think you can live by your own rules, take what you want from hard-working Americans, and then lie about it when confronted." Elena watched her father's jaw tighten, but his voice remained controlled. "I've lived in this town for 15 years. I've never stolen anything from anyone. I work hard, pay my taxes, and try to be a good neighbor. Turn around, Redhawk." "Sheriff, please, I said turn around!" Wade's voice exploded across the yard. Elena's small hands pressed against the glass as she watched her father slowly comply. The metallic click of handcuffs echoed in the desert air like gunshots. "Papa!" Elena burst through the front door, running toward the three men. "Papa, what's happening?" Thomas turned as much as the restraints would allow, his eyes meeting his daughter's. In that moment, Elena saw something she had never seen before in her father's face. Fear. Not fear for himself, but fear for her, for what this moment would do to her young heart. Eleanor, Mija, listen to me, Thomas said urgently as Deputy Collins helped Wade guide him toward the patrol car. Remember what I taught you about strength. Remember who you are. You're making a mistake, Elena shouted at Sheriff Wade, her young voice cracking with emotion. My father didn't steal anything. Wade looked down at her with a mixture of annoyance and dismissive pity. Little girl, your father is a thief. The sooner you accept that and forget about him, the better off you'll be. I'll never forget, Elena screamed, tears streaming down her face. I'll never forget what you did. Wade paused, looking back at the 8-year-old girl with her defiant stance and tear-stained cheeks. A cold smile played at the corners of his mouth. You'll forget, kid. They all do. In a few years, you won't even remember his face. And the patrol car doors slammed shut with a finality that seemed to echo through Elena's soul. She watched as the vehicle disappeared down the dusty road, carrying her father away from everything they had built together. Mrs. Garcia, their elderly neighbor, emerged from her house and hurried over to Elena, wrapping the sobbing child in her arms. Mija, come. You can't stay here alone. As Elena allowed herself to be led away, she turned back one last time to look at their small house. The fence post her father had been mending lay abandoned, its repair left forever unfinished. But in that moment, watching the dust settle where the sheriff's car had been, Elena made a promise that would shape the rest of her life. She would not forget. She would never forget. And someday, she would make sure justice was served. 15 years had passed since that devastating afternoon in Copper Ridge, but Elena Redhawk remembered every detail as if it had happened yesterday. Now 23, she stood at the edge of the police academy graduation ceremony in Phoenix, her hand resting on the newly pinned badge on her uniform. The silver star caught the Arizona sun just as Sheriff Wade's had all those years ago, but this one represented something entirely different, earned through merit, dedication, and an unwavering commitment to true justice. The ceremony had been a blur of congratulations and celebrations, but Elena's mind was elsewhere. She had spent the last 4 years working toward this moment, excelling in every aspect of her training. Criminal justice courses, physical conditioning, firearms training, legal studies. She had approached each challenge with the focused determination of someone who understood that preparation was the difference between justice and revenge. Officer Redhawk called Captain Martinez, the Academy's lead instructor, as she approached Elena after the ceremony. I wanted to speak with you before you head to your assignment. Elena turned, her posture straight and professional. Captain Martinez had been a mentor throughout her training, one of the few instructors who had taken the time to understand her motivation without judging it. Yes, Captain? Your request for assignment to Copper Ridge was unusual. Most new officers want to start in larger departments, gain experience in busier jurisdictions. Martinez studied Elena's face carefully. But your instructors and I have discussed it, and given your exceptional performance and your personal connection to the area, we've approved the transfer. Elena felt her heart skip a beat. After months of bureaucratic uncertainty, it was finally happening. Thank you, Captain. I won't let you down. I know you won't. But Elena, Martinez placed a hand on her shoulder, remember why you became a police officer. Justice, not vengeance. The badge you're wearing represents something bigger than personal grievances. I understand, Captain. I've never forgotten that. 2 days later, Elena drove through the familiar desert landscape toward Copper Ridge, her personal belongings packed in the back of her pickup truck. The town hadn't changed much. The same sun-bleached buildings, the same wide main street, the same sense of isolation that came from being surrounded by endless miles of desert. But Elena was different. Where once an 8-year-old girl had watched helplessly, now a trained law enforcement officer returned with the authority to seek the truth. The Copper Ridge Sheriff's Department was a modest building on Main Street, its brick facade weathered by decades of desert winds. Elena parked her truck and sat for a moment, gathering her thoughts. Through the large front windows, she could see figures moving around inside, deputies going about their daily routines, unaware that their world was about to change. Sheriff Marcus Wade was still there. Elena had confirmed this through careful research over the years. He was older now, his hair completely grey, but he remained the undisputed authority in Copper Ridge. The man who had torn her family apart was still wearing a badge, still making decisions that affected people's lives. Elena stepped out of her truck and walked toward the building, her uniform crisp and her badge gleaming. The bell above the door chimed as she entered, and conversations gradually died as the deputies noticed the newcomer. "Can I help you?" asked a middle-aged deputy from behind the front desk. His name tag read Collins, the same Deputy Collins who had stood silently while Wade arrested her father. "Officer Eleanor Redhawk, reporting for duty," she said, presenting her transfer papers. Collins took the documents, scanning them quickly. "Redhawk? That name sounds familiar." "It should," Elena replied calmly. "I grew up here." Before Collins could respond, a door at the back of the office opened, and Sheriff Marcus Wade emerged. He looked exactly as Elena remembered, though time had added lines to his face and a slight stoop to his shoulders. His eyes still held that same calculating coldness she remembered from her childhood. Wade's gaze fell on Elena, and for a moment she saw a flicker of confusion cross his features. Something about her was familiar, but he couldn't quite place it. "Sheriff Wade," Elena said, stepping forward with her hand extended. "Officer Elena Redhawk, I'm your new deputy." Wade shook her hand, his grip firm and assessing. "Redhawk, unusual name around these parts. You're not from around here originally, are you?" Elena met his gaze steadily. "Actually, I am. Born and raised in Copper Ridge. Left after family circumstances changed." Something in her tone made Wade look more closely at her face. Elena watched as recognition slowly dawned in his eyes. The shape of her features, the determined set of her jaw, the unmistakable resemblance to a man he had arrested 15 years ago. "Thomas Redhawk," Wade said slowly, the name falling from his lips like a curse. "You're Thomas Redhawk's daughter." The office fell silent. Every deputy in the building seemed to sense the tension crackling between the new officer and their sheriff. "Yes, I am," Elena replied, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside her. "Is that going to be a problem, Sheriff?" Wade's eyes narrowed. He had expected never to see that little girl again, had assumed she would disappear into the foster system or reservation life, forgotten and inconsequential. Instead, she stood before him wearing a badge, representing everything he had tried to keep her from becoming. "No problem at all, Officer Redhawk," Wade said finally, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Welcome to the Copper Ridge Sheriff's Department. I trust you'll fit right in." Eleanor smiled, but there was steel behind it. "I'm sure I will, Sheriff. After all, I've been preparing for this moment for a very long time." As Wade turned and walked back to his office, Elena caught sight of his expression in the reflection of a window. For the first time in 15 years, Sheriff Marcus Wade looked uncertain. The little girl he had dismissed as forgettable had returned as a woman who could not be dismissed, carrying a badge that gave her the authority to ask questions he might not want to answer. Elena looked around the office that would now be her workplace, taking in the faces of the deputies who would be her colleagues. Some looked curious, others seemed uncomfortable with the obvious tension between her and Wade. But Elena didn't need their approval or friendship. She needed only one thing, the truth about what really happened to her father. And now, for the first time since that terrible day, she had the power to find it. 3 months into her assignment in Copper Ridge, Elena had established herself as a thorough and dedicated officer. She arrived early, stayed late, and approached every case with meticulous attention to detail. Her fellow deputies had begun to respect her work ethic, though the tension between her and Sheriff Wade remained palpable. Elena used her position strategically, building relationships with longtime residents and slowly gathering information about the events surrounding her father's arrest. What she discovered painted a picture far different from the official story Wade had maintained for 15 years. On a sweltering Tuesday morning, Elena was reviewing old case files in the department's dusty archives when Deputy Sarah Chen, one of the younger officers, approached her desk. "Elena, I found something you might be interested in," Sarah said, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard. She had become Elena's closest ally in the department, drawn by Elena's integrity and professionalism. Elena looked up from the files spread across her desk. "What is it?" Sarah pulled up a chair and lowered her voice. "I was talking to my grandmother last night. She's lived here for 60 years, and your father came up in conversation. She said something that didn't match what's in the official reports." Elena's pulse quickened, but she kept her expression neutral. "What did she say?" She remembered that week clearly because it was right after her husband died. "She said she saw your father at the hardware store the same afternoon the cattle theft supposedly happened. The store receipt would have time-stamped his purchase, but..." Sarah hesitated. "But what?" "The hardware store records from that period are missing from the evidence files. According to the case notes, they were never collected." Eleanor felt a familiar anger building in her chest, but she forced herself to remain calm. "That's an interesting oversight." "There's more," Sarah continued. "My grandmother also mentioned that Frank Morrison, the rancher who reported the theft, had been having financial problems around that time. His ranch was in debt, and there were rumors he might lose it." This was new information. Elena had focused most of her investigation on proving her father's innocence, but she hadn't considered who might have had motive to falsely report a theft. Insurance fraud was a possibility she hadn't explored. "Sarah, I need you to help me with something, but it has to stay between us." Sarah nodded. "What do you need?" "I want to visit the Morrison Ranch. Officially, we're following up on a different case, but I want to look around, maybe talk to some of the workers who were there 15 years ago." That afternoon, Elena and Sarah drove out to the Morrison Ranch, a sprawling property about 20 miles outside of town. The ranch was more prosperous now than Elena remembered. New buildings, well-maintained fences, modern equipment. Frank Morrison had apparently overcome his financial difficulties. Morrison himself was a heavy-set man in his 60s, with sun-weathered skin and suspicious eyes. When Elena introduced herself, she watched his expression carefully for any sign of recognition. "Officer Redhawk," Morrison repeated, scratching his chin. "That name rings a bell." "My father is Thomas Redhawk. You reported cattle stolen from your ranch 15 years ago, and he was arrested for the crime." Morrison's face hardened. "I remember now. Your father cost me 20 head of cattle. I hope he got what he deserved in prison." Eleanor bit back her first response. "Mr. Morrison, I'm here on official business regarding some recent thefts in the area. I was hoping to speak with any of your workers who might have been here during the time of the original incident." Morrison shifted uncomfortably. "Most of my old crew moved on. Times change." "What about Miguel Santos?" Elena asked. "He was your foreman back then." "Miguel?" Morrison's voice tightened. "He left town after the situation with your father. Took a job in Mexico, I think." Sarah stepped in. "Do you have any contact info for him?" Morrison shook his head. "No. He didn't leave a forwarding address." As they walked back to their car, Elena paused. eyeing an old shed behind a newer building. Its paint was peeling and faint burn marks scarred the door. "Sarah, see that shed?" "Yeah." "Why?" "My father's case file mentioned a fire here that destroyed evidence, but it was never clear what exactly burned or when." They drove back to town in thoughtful silence, but Elena's mind was racing. Every piece of information she gathered seemed to point toward the same conclusion. Her father's case had been deliberately mishandled, evidence had been overlooked or destroyed, and key witnesses had conveniently disappeared. That evening, Elena sat in her small apartment, surrounded by copies of police reports, newspaper clippings, and notes from her conversations with longtime residents. The pattern was becoming clearer, but she still needed concrete proof. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar number with a Mexican area code. "Hello? Is this Elena Redhawk?" The voice was heavily accented, cautious. "Yes, who is this?" "My name is Miguel Santos. I heard you were asking about me at the Morrison Ranch." Elena's heart began to race. "Mr. Santos, yes, I was hoping to speak with you about events that happened 15 years ago." There was a long pause. "I've been waiting 15 years for someone to ask the right questions. Your father, Thomas, he was a good man. He didn't steal those cattle. Can you tell me what really happened?" Another pause, longer this time. "Not over the phone. It's not safe. But I can tell you this, Frank Morrison was desperate for money. His ranch was failing, and he had insurance on those cattle. The fire that destroyed the evidence? That wasn't an accident." Eleanor gripped the phone tightly. "Mr. Santos, would you be willing to come back to testify, to tell the truth about what happened? I have family now, a good life. Coming back would be dangerous for me, but I kept something all these years. Something I was too afraid to give to the police at the time." "What is it?" "Documents. Financial records that Morrison thought he destroyed in the fire. Proof of his insurance claims. Proof that he sold those cattle himself and then reported them stolen. I was his foreman. I helped him move them to a buyer in Nevada." Elena could hardly breathe. "Mr. Santos, that evidence could exonerate my father. It could prove his innocence." "I know. That's why I kept it. I always hoped someday the truth would matter more than money and fear." "Will you help me? Will you come forward?" There was a long silence before Miguel Santos spoke again. "Your father saved my son's life once, pulled him out of a flooded irrigation ditch during a storm. I owed Thomas a debt I could never repay. Maybe now I can." As Elena hung up the phone, she felt something she hadn't experienced in 15 years. Hope. Not just hope for justice, but hope that the truth was finally within reach. Her father had been innocent, just as she had always believed. Now she had to figure out how to prove it without putting Miguel Santos or his family in danger. Sheriff Wade had underestimated her once, thinking she would forget and disappear. He was about to learn that Elena Redhawk remembered everything, and she was just getting started. The confrontation Elena had been preparing for 15 years finally came on a scorching Thursday afternoon in July. Armed with Miguel Santos's testimony and the damning financial documents he had preserved, Elena had spent weeks building an airtight case. But she knew that exposing the truth would require more than evidence. It would require courage to stand up to a system that had protected Sheriff Wade for decades. Elena sat across from District Attorney Patricia Williams in the county courthouse, spreading out photocopies of insurance documents, bank records, and Miguel's sworn affidavit across the conference table. Williams, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s, had driven up from the county seat specifically to review Elena's findings. "This is substantial evidence, Officer Redhawk," Williams said, studying the documents. "Miguel Santos's testimony corroborates what these financial records suggest, that Frank Morrison orchestrated an insurance fraud scheme and your father was framed to cover it up." Elena nodded. "Miguel was Morrison's foreman. He has first-hand knowledge of how the cattle were sold to a buyer in Nevada before Morrison reported them stolen. The fire that supposedly destroyed evidence at the ranch was deliberately set to cover up financial records that would have exposed the fraud." "And Sheriff Wade?" Elena's jaw tightened. "At minimum, Wade conducted a negligent investigation. He failed to collect basic evidence, ignored witness statements that could have provided my father with an alibi, and rushed to arrest the most convenient suspect. Whether it was incompetence or something more deliberate, his actions resulted in an innocent man being imprisoned." Williams closed the file and looked directly at Elena. "You understand what you're asking me to do? Wade has been sheriff for over 20 years. He has connections throughout the county, political allies, friends in high places. Challenging him won't be easy." "I'm not asking for anything except justice," Eleanor told DA Williams. "My father spent 8 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. Frank Morrison committed insurance fraud, and Sheriff Wade either helped cover it up or ignored it." Williams looked at her closely. "What happened to your father after prison?" "He was broken. The shame destroyed him. He died 3 years ago, never knowing he'd be cleared." "I'm sorry." "Then help me make sure this never happens again." Williams gathered the evidence. "I'll speak to Miguel Santos and verify the records. If it checks out, I'll convene a grand jury. And Wade, if there's proof of misconduct or conspiracy, we'll charge him. But be ready, Elena. Wade and Morrison won't go quietly." 2 weeks later, phones rang non-stop at the department. Deputy Collins looked up, alarmed. "Sheriff Wade, Channel 7 wants a comment about Thomas Redhawk's reopened case." Wade stormed out of his office, already furious, his eyes locked on Elena. "Officer Redhawk, my office, now!" Behind closed doors, he erupted. "You gave the DA evidence? They're reopening your father's case?" "I did," Elena said calmly. "The evidence points to Frank Morrison's fraud, supported by financial records and testimony from Miguel Santos." Wade's composure cracked. "Your father was guilty." "Actually," she replied, "he wasn't. And now the truth is finally coming out." Wade's face went pale. "Miguel Santos left town years ago. You can't possibly—" "He kept records, Sheriff. Documents that prove Morrison sold those cattle himself before reporting them stolen. Documents that show Morrison was facing bankruptcy and needed the insurance money to save his ranch." Wade was quiet for a long moment, and Elena could see him calculating his options. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and threatening. "You have no idea what you're messing with, little girl. Your father was a thief and a liar, just like his daughter. You think a badge makes you somebody special. You think it gives you the right to come into my town and make accusations." Elena felt the same anger she had experienced as an 8-year-old child, but now she had the training and authority to channel it constructively. "Sheriff Wade, I think we both know what really happened 15 years ago. The question is whether you were part of Morrison's scheme or just too incompetent to see through it." Wade's hand moved toward his weapon, and Elena tensed, ready to respond if necessary. But instead of drawing his gun, Wade pointed a shaking finger at her. "You're suspended, effective immediately. Badge and weapon on my desk." Elena smiled calmly. "Actually, Sheriff, I don't think I am. You see, about an hour ago, the State Attorney General's office served warrants for your arrest on charges of obstruction of justice, conspiracy to commit fraud, and violation of civil rights under color of law. As if summoned by her words, the office door opened and 3 state investigators entered, led by Detective Lieutenant James Rivera. "Sheriff Marcus Wade," Rivera announced, "you're under arrest." Wade's face went through a range of emotions: shock, anger, fear, and finally resignation. As the handcuffs clicked into place, he looked at Elena one last time. "You think this changes anything? You think this brings your father back?" Elena stepped closer to Wade, her voice steady and clear. "No, it doesn't bring my father back, but it ensures that what happened to him won't happen to anyone else. And Sheriff," she paused, watching as he was led toward the door, "I told you I would never forget. I keep my promises." 6 months later, Elena stood once again in the courthouse where she had first presented her evidence to District Attorney Williams. This time, it was for the sentencing of Marcus Wade and Frank Morrison, both convicted for the conspiracy that had destroyed her father's life. Wade received 12 years in federal prison. Morrison, having cooperated and agreed to pay restitution, was sentenced to 8. Most importantly to Elena, her father's conviction was overturned and his name was cleared at last. Outside, in the bright Arizona sun, Williams approached and offered his hand. "Justice served, Officer Redhawk. Your father would be proud." "Thank you for believing in the evidence," she replied, feeling both closure and sorrow. When asked about her future, Elena shared the news. "I've accepted a position with the FBI's Public Corruption Unit. They noticed my work on this case." "It's a big opportunity," Williams said. "It is, and it means I can make sure this doesn't happen to other families. There are more like Wade out there who think they're untouchable." That evening, she drove back to Copper Ridge one last time, along the same desert highway of her youth. The old house where she'd lived with her father still stood, now freshly painted with a new garden. She parked across the street, remembering the man who had taught her strength, dignity, and integrity. "I kept my promise, Papa," she whispered to the desert wind. "I never forgot, and now everyone knows the truth." As she drove away from Copper Ridge for the last time, she felt the weight of 15 years finally lift. She had returned not for revenge, but for justice, and in doing so, she